Hi, I'm John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. If we think that the most significant issues that are facing our students are issues of morality, we haven't quite gotten it. And that's really what I want to get into in this session about the sexual revolution and its victims. And the first thing I want to do is point you to an article. And I encourage you to read this article because it really is that important. It was written in 2013 by a blogger named Rod Dreher. Rod Dreher writes over at The American Conservative. And the name of this article is Sex After Christianity. So when you Google that, please Google it carefully, okay? Sex After Christianity. But in this article, let me scratch my eyeball right here. But in this article, Sex After Christianity, Rod uses a phrase that he calls the cosmological shift. In this session, we're going to talk about the sexual revolution. Now, it's clear that almost every point of conflict between the larger culture and Christianity, whether it's in terms of what we want for our kids, whether it's in terms of how we think we should run our businesses, or all kinds of different issues, has to do with a collision on areas of sexuality. And we're tempted to think about the sexual revolution as being primarily a moral revolution. In other words, that things have changed. Things that once were considered wrong are now considered right. And things that were once considered right are now considered wrong. And that sort of shift has been the real story of the sexual revolution. Now, obviously, it's true that there has been a moral shift in our society when it comes to questions about sexuality. Things that were considered taboo just yesterday seem to be considered normal, even some sort of, kind of privileged thing in our cultural moment today. So there has been a moral revolution. But please do not understand the sexual revolution as being a moral revolution. The moral shift that we have seen in our society has been the fruit, not the root. It's been the effect, not the cause. The revolution, the sexual revolution, has been a deeper one than just one of behavior. It's fundamentally been at the level of cosmology. In other words, it's been at the level of what we think reality itself actually is. It's been at the deepest levels of our worldview as a collective culture. And specifically, it's been a shift in what we think human beings are, what makes them who they are. I bring that up because we have not had a more successful social revolution in our lifetime than the sexual revolution. You can't understand our cultural moment without understanding just how much the sexual revolution has, in fact, changed about how we see the world, about what we think is right and wrong, and about how we see each other. Several months ago, I was speaking to a group of grandparents. I don't always speak to a group of grandparents, but I was. And it struck me just to ask who the oldest person was in the room, which is a dangerous thing to ask, except with a group of grandparents, sometimes there's one guy who's super proud of it. And there was this guy. He was probably, if I remember correctly, he was about 96 years old. And I asked him, and we did the math, when I asked him how old he was, just when he was born. And he saw in his lifetime most of the 20th century. I mean, can you imagine that? World War I, World War II, all the different social movements that took place in the 20th century. I mean, the 20th century was one revolution after another. Some of these revolutions were economic ones. Some of them were political ones. Some of them were cultural ones. I mean, unbelievable what this guy had seen in his life. And yet, if you set all of these things side by side, the single most successful revolution, the one that's changed more about the modern world, that has flipped upside down how we think about ourselves and the world and our place in it, and nothing else really comes close, is the sexual revolution. If you talk about body count, you talk about how many that are killed, obviously it's hard to kind of, do a one-to-one comparison when you're thinking about the Holocaust, unless, of course, you chalk up abortion as part of the sexual revolution, which you should. And at that point, the sexual revolution becomes the bloodiest revolution of the 20th century. That's saying something. But more than that, you can kind of look at some of these revolutions and say, well, it changed how we think about economics, or it changed how we think about market forces, or maybe it changed how we think about the political process. Name one thing in the modern world that is not touched in some way or another by our new ideas about human sexuality and human identity. This is how sweeping it is. There's not a single aspect of culture right now, that remains untouched. Now, I bring this up because if what we're doing is trying to prepare a new generation to engage this culture well, and to follow Jesus despite the challenges of today's world, and to become the sort of champions of the gospel and restorers and reconcilers that is part of our mission statement, there's no way we can do that without understanding the thing that has so dramatically flipped our culture upside down, the sexual revolution. Now, how do we understand the scope of the revolution that has taken place? Let me give you an illustration from several years ago that I hope will help. I'm a basketball guy. I know there's no evidence of it, but I do. I love basketball. Used to play basketball and love college game more than NBA, but I still like the NBA. You might remember several years ago, there was a story that made headlines across America from the NBA, but really across the world, and news stories and everything else. It was the cover story of a Sports Illustrated article that was titled, "I'm Black, I'm Gay, and I'm in the NBA." Do you remember that? It was a confession of sorts, an article by a guy named Jason Collins. Now, Jason Collins was a well-liked, good player, solid contributor on a whole lot of NBA teams. Never a star, but just kind of got traded around, played for a lot of different teams. And in Sports Illustrated, he became the first male athlete still active in one of the major team sports. There had been, divers and, tennis players and things like that. But here you have an athlete still active in a major sport, major team sport. And I mean the NBA, the NFL, the MLB, those are the biggies. First one to announce that he's a gay man. He did it in Sports Illustrated. And it was a remarkable thing how quickly this headline took over really the cultural conversation. And a lot of people wanted to know if the NBA was ready for this and if the world were ready for this sort of thing. And I remember traveling when this came out, and I just followed it really closely because how it was being talked about I thought was absolutely fascinating. Whenever someone makes an announcement like this, and by the way, I have no hesitation to say that Jason Collins showed courage in order to announce this. I've been in enough locker rooms to know that it's just not an acceptable sort of thing to say, at least back then. And but if he was expecting any sort of negative pushback, he didn't get it. He actually got a remarkable amount of support. Past NBA players expressed their support. Current NBA players, some of the best players in the game, actually supported him. Michelle Obama, the first lady at the time, tweeted her support, said, "Jason, we've got your back." And President Obama picked up the phone, called him, and congratulated him on making the announcement. And whenever an announcement like this is made, you kind of hear this sort of language, and that's what we heard. Finally, Jason Collins can just be himself. He no longer has to hide who he is. Well, as I said, I wanted to see what people were talking, how people were talking about this story. I was traveling, so I went to my hotel room, turned on ESPN, and the show was on called Outside the Lines, which deals with controversial sports issues. And it was just an interview-based show that day. And they were asking one of my favorite NBA analysts, a guy named Chris Broussard, about the story. And he's there on the panel, and they're saying, hey, is this going to change his career? Does this, limit his prospects in the future? Are more players going to come out? I mean, all legitimate basketball-related questions. But then they asked Chris Broussard a different sort of question, because Chris Broussard is known not only as a great NBA analyst, but he's been pretty upfront about his Christian faith. And in Jason Collins' article, in the middle of it somewhere, he actually said something about being a Christian and how he believed that God didn't judge him and that God created him that way, and so on and so on. So in the middle of this interview, Chris Broussard, after being asked all these NBA questions, is then asked this question. Hey, Chris, you're a Christian too. What do you think about that? Do you think Jason Collins is a real Christian? Can you be a gay Christian, Chris, on national TV? How do you answer that question? Well, Chris Broussard said, as a Christian, I believe God created sex to be in the context of marriage between a man and a woman, and anything outside of that, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, would be sinful. How do you think that got received? I mean, people were really angry. They called for his firing. They called for his resignation. They called for his execution at dawn. And what he heard was this: you can't say those things. You have to keep those views to yourself. Now you say, John, what's all this have to do with the cosmological shift and this big sexual revolution and the power that it's had in American culture? Well, stay with me, because I think in that story of Jason Collins, we see the shift having taken place before our very eyes. You see, in the history of Western civilization, there was a number of different ideological and philosophical influences. What I mean by that is that, there's not a whole lot common across the spectrum in Western civ, different ideas, some more atheistic, for example, out of the secular Enlightenment, some more kind of classical, pagan mythology, and certainly the Judeo-Christian influence. So you have this melting pot of ideas that shape up Western civilization. So there wasn't a whole lot that across Western civ we had in common. Except one thing, which is that we saw human beings as being primarily metaphysical creatures. Now, I know that's a big polysyllabic word, but all I mean is that we understood Christians to be thinkers, to be people who think about their life and why they're here. We don't just exist. We ask why we exist. We ask questions like, who are we and why am I here and what's right and wrong and who gets to set the rules and so on and so on and so on. And we ask these big metaphysical or moral questions up front, and then our behavior is on the side. So we justify our behavior by our philosophizing, if that makes sense. So we're metaphysical creatures with our behavior on the side. Doesn't mean we all answer the questions the same way. All of those different traditions will answer them very differently and behave differently. But the answers and the questions come first, the behavior comes second. Now, what's that got to do with Jason Collins and Chris Broussard? Well, Jason Collins makes an announcement about what we considered to be behavior until yesterday, his sexuality. And he's not told that's on the side, he's told that's who he is. Chris Broussard makes a metaphysical observation about right and wrong, and he's told, oh, wait, you have to keep that to yourself. Do you see the exchange? See, that's what the sexual revolution has done to us, is that it's actually exchanged metaphysics for behavior. And now we put sexual behavior at the most defining level of who we are and the way the world is. Can you think of one other area in which we have so redefined so many other areas than sexuality? That's the power of the sexual revolution. Now, how do we understand the sexual revolution? I think there are three central ideas to the sexual revolution that you have to understand. And if you understand those ideas, you can understand their consequences. And if you understand their consequences, you can also understand their bad consequences. You probably have heard that phrase, ideas have consequences. What we like to say at the Colson Center is, ideas have consequences, so bad ideas have victims. And there are all kinds of victims of the sexual revolution, and we'll get into those. But let me go through the three central ideas of the sexual revolution. The first idea of the sexual revolution is one, when you really look at it, you realize just how dramatically things have changed. Here it is, that sex, marriage, and babies are separable. Sex, marriage, and babies are separable. You have to understand that up until yesterday, culturally speaking, sex, marriage, and babies were considered a package deal. And the reason is, as Maggie Gallagher says, sex makes babies, and society needs babies, and babies need a mom and a dad. No matter where you go in the history of the world, no matter where you go in civilization, those three things are true. Sex makes babies. Society needs babies because society has a mortality rate, and you've got to replace the population, and babies need a mom and a dad. Because of that, sex, marriage, and babies have always been seen as a package deal. I'll give you a couple illustrations of this. If you're from the South at all, or have ever been to the South, or maybe have read about the South, maybe you've heard about something called shotgun weddings, right? Now, shotgun weddings, here's the story. Guy gets girl pregnant. Dad goes to guy's house, sometimes in the middle of the night and sometimes with assistance, but always with a shotgun, and forces the guy to marry the daughter because that's the right thing to do. Now, this story ends differently today, right? Dad might go to the guy's house with a gun, but it's not to put them together, it's to keep them apart, right? That's how things have changed. Sex, marriage, and babies were considered a package deal. If you go to the liturgies of wedding ceremonies in any sort of Christian denomination, and even just what was commonly done in Western culture, what you'll find there is somewhere between a blessing for children or a command, now go have some babies. Sex, marriage, and babies were considered to be a package deal. I'll give you another example. When I went to get a marriage license because I wanted to propose to the woman who did say yes, Sarah, to become my wife. We were in Tennessee. And I went to the Rhea County clerk and I said, hey, I want a marriage license. And she said, well, before you get married, or before I give you this marriage license, you need to answer these questions. It's fascinating what questions she asked. Because in the run-up to the what's called the Obergefell decision from the Supreme Court, which gave same-sex marriage universally, unequivocally to America, the conversation was things like love is love. Heterosexual love and homosexual love are the same kind of love. Who are you to say that they're not sincere in their love? In other words, that extension or expansion of marriage to include same-sex couples was sold to us on sincerity of feeling or sincerity of emotion. It wasn't sold to us in the same way that the government has shown interest about marriage forever. Right? So when I went and said, hey, I want a marriage license, the Rhea County clerk did not ask me how sincere I was in my affection for my wife. She didn't say, well, wait a minute, are you sure you're in love? Are you really in love? Are you guys going to stay together forever? You know, here's Cosmo Magazine, how to know you're in love. If you can pass this test from Cosmo Magazine, I'll give you a marriage license. She didn't say any of that stuff. In fact, the government has never expressed any interest whatsoever in how strongly partners feel about each other. Government doesn't care how strongly you feel about your tennis partner or even sisters or siblings. Imagine two elderly sisters who have shared a life for 50 years. Maybe one of them got married and lost her husband early, so she is a widow and she moved in with her sister who never got married, and together they've built a life over 50 years. They go shopping every week. They go to church every week. They haven't missed an episode of Jeopardy in 25 years. Like, they love each other, but the government doesn't ask any questions about the sincerity of that union. And when I went to get this marriage license, what was fascinating is, here are the questions that I was asked. Number one is, are you old enough? Now, why would they ask if I'm old enough? Well, because if I'm not old enough, I'm still considered a child. The second question was, are either of you already married? Because if you're already married, you can't be married to more than one person at one time. Why? Because of the potential for the children. And then this one really shows this inherent connection between sex, marriage, and babies. I was asked, literally, by the Rhea County Courthouse, and if you remember, you might have been too, are you in any way related to the person you want to marry? Now, think about this, and I'm not trying to go down some sort of creepy road here, but outside of cases of abuse, is there any reason to assume that a brother and sister could not be sincerely and passionately and deeply emotionally connected with each other in the same way as any married couple? No. So why do we say brothers and sisters can't get married? It has nothing to do with the sincerity of their affection. It's because of the potential for the offspring, for the child. You see, from the beginning until yesterday, the only thing that the government cared about was the relationship of marriage to children. The government has vested interest in the perpetuation of their society. Children guarantee the perpetuation of society, so the government cared about children. But this underscores something that we've always had until, again, culturally speaking, yesterday. Sex, marriage, and babies were a package deal. Now, how did they get separate? Well, it's the sexual revolution. One part was wanting to have some sort of freedom in sexual morality. In other words, we wanted to have sex without marriage. But the only way you can have sex without marriage is if you find a consistent way to have sex without babies. Right? And that's why, by the way, ideas alone don't change the world. Ideas usually take something else, like champions. For example, there were ideas at the heart of the Protestant Reformation, but it took some champions. And not just champions, it took some artifacts, right? You never would have had the Protestant Reformation had you not had the greatest invention in the history of the world, which was the iPad. No, I'm just kidding. It's not the iPad. It's the printing press, right? The printing press gave everyone the scripture in their own language at a cost that they could afford, which made the ideas of the Protestant Reformation, that we didn't need to go to the priest, we could go right to God, that made that even possible. In the same way, we wanted sex without marriage. The only way to have sex without marriage is to find a consistent way to have sex without babies. And so there's an artifact. contraception was one of the artifacts that made the sexual revolution possible. So first we wanted sex without marriage. The only way to have sex without marriage is to have sex without babies. And then we wanted babies without marriage, right? You might remember, it's one of the more ridiculous moments in American history, which is saying something, when a real-life presidential candidate, Dan Quayle, had a fight on television with somebody who didn't exist in real life, Murphy Brown, who was a single career woman in a sitcom who wanted to be artificially inseminated and have a child. Remember this? Yeah. And they fought back and forth, and it probably cost him the election. Either that or he didn't spell potato right? So in other words, this was a moment in American history. We wanted sex without marriage. The only way to have sex without marriage is to have sex without babies. And we wanted babies without marriage. And now it's quite common to have marriage without babies. Now, I know I'm not talking about infertility. I'm not talking about unintentional childless marriage. I'm talking about intentional childless marriages. This is actually a brand new thing. Certainly was never understood to be part of marriage in Christian history, but really wasn't even understood to be part of it outside of Christian history. I wrote a book several years ago on same-sex marriage, to make friends. And one of the things that I found was no society until ours even imagined that two men or two women could get married. And one of the reasons, and we often say, well, it's because of the Bible or Christianity. It has nothing to do with it whatsoever. In fact, there's plenty of societies, plenty of cultures throughout history that had no Christian influence, right? Before Christianity even had an influence. And they still, even though they had no moral problem whatsoever with homosexual or homoerotic activity, still did not think it was the same thing as marriage. Did not think that marriage included. Why? Well, because there's a big difference between a homosexual romantic relationship and a heterosexual romantic relationship. A homosexual romantic relationship is infertile. And everyone knows. A heterosexual one is not. And so sex, marriage, and babies were a package deal. Now, we've reached the ultimate category of this, right? Which is not only sex without marriage and sex without babies and babies without marriage and marriage without babies, but now one of the great ethical dilemmas of our day is babies without sex. In vitro fertilization, artificial insemination, and so on. To the point now we have two state legislatures on opposite coast who have legalized commercial surrogacy, which is an industry way of doing surrogacy, which every country in the European Union has banned because of its potential exploitation for women and children. But those laws for commercial surrogacy are often advanced by, in fact, in both of these cases, they're being advanced by gay legislators in gay marriages. So think about this. You have individuals who have chosen a union that is sterile. I'm not saying it's moral or immoral at this point, just sterile. It's obviously sterile. And that same union now is demanding children. So sex, marriage, and babies are separable. By the way, no-fault divorce is an example of separating sex, marriage, and babies. Because one of the things that we said is we should stay married for the kids. That chapter of the sexual revolution, divorce, no-fault divorce in particular, said, the kids will be fine. Kids don't need married parents. Kids need happy parents. See how the game is changing? See, we just changed the whole definition of the category of meaning. Anyway, kids don't need married parents. Kids need happy parents. And that was said over and over and over and over again, as if it were true. Let me just tell you right now, no one knew if it were true. Now we know. We know that it's not true. We know that by and large, with very, very few exceptions, in cases of abuse and danger and so on, kids from married parents, on average, do better than kids from happy parents that aren't married. Marriage is something else. So sex, marriage, and babies, considered a package deal until just yesterday. That's the first idea of the sexual revolution. Here's the second idea, that men and women are interchangeable. Men and women are interchangeable. Now, this has been a long journey through the sexual revolution. In fact, there has been a journey, part of this journey is prior to the sexual revolution. If you look back at what's known as first wave feminism, which was led, by the way, by mostly Christians who believed that women were being left out of society in ways that weren't just, and they were trying to give women an equal voice. Many of them, by the way, pro-life, which is a fascinating part of the story. This is pre-sexual revolution. Then the argument of the first wave feminists was this: men and women should have equality in rights, that there were certain rights that men were enjoying that women were not, and that wasn't right, and we should have rights to vote, to participate in society, to work, all that, and so, own land, all kinds of things, all right? So that's the first chapter. It was somewhere near the beginning of the sexual revolution in which feminism was hijacked by the sexual revolution. And this is what we often call second wave feminism. First wave feminism was about men and women having equality and rights. And that was largely a just cause. Second wave feminism was men and women are interchangeable in roles. And that was a mixed bag, because certainly there were some roles women were being left out of in society that they shouldn't have been. But there are some roles that actually go back to the distinct differences between men and women, and those started to get blurred, right? And so what ended up happening there is that was a mixed bag. So men and women were interchangeable in rights. That's the first chapter. Men and women interchangeable in roles. That's the second chapter. And let's fast forward to today. How do we fast forward to today? Well, just recently, Justice Neil Gorsuch, issued a decision in one of the more important cases of the 2020 Supreme Court term. It had to do with employment rights and whether what's called Title VII, which is part of the Civil Rights Act, would be extended, where the word sex would then imply sexual orientation and gender identity. Certainly something that the framers of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 never imagined. And he decided that it was. He didn't say necessarily that sex means sexual orientation and gender identity. He just says you can't discriminate against sexual orientation and gender identity unless you're already previously discriminating against sex. It was a rhetorical jujitsu that basically rewrote civil rights law. Instead of happening in the legislature, it happened in the courts. So, what does this mean? In the middle of this, he talks about one of the cases that that was part of this whole decision. It had to do with an employee of a funeral home in Michigan who was hired as a man, and he wrote a letter to his employer announcing that he was going to come back to work after a brief vacation as a woman, identifying as a woman with a new name and that sort of thing. In the opinion, as Neil Gorsuch is talking about this, our Supreme Court Justice said that when this woman was hired, she was a woman identifying as a man. Think about how untrue that statement is. Because in reality, this was a man who had male chromosomes, male genitalia, male identification, male names, male expression, and then had identified later on as a woman. So in other words, we've reached a whole new level of this, where men and women being interchangeable in rights have moved to men and women being interchangeable in roles. What do we talk about now? As if men and women are interchangeable in reality. As if sex itself, not just gender, as if biological sex is nothing but a social construct. During the HB2 hearings in North Carolina, a child psychologist for Duke University said that things like chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, and external genitalia are not scientific ways of talking about sex and gender. So now we have taken what is the real physical human body and divorced it from how we understand male and female. So we literally are preparing a generation of students for the world that J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, found when she opposed the phrase, people who menstruate, and said, wait a minute, I thought we used to call them women. And she was called a hateful, intolerant, bigoted. And the phrase was, well, some men do that too. And some men have babies. Of course, this is going to challenge sports. You may already have had this situation in sports. I've seen that situation at a Christian school, playing a local public school. That has been actually one of the situations. You're going to have that sort of situation perhaps in policy, and who we let in our schools, who we let in our churches, where we do, who gets to use what bathroom and why and how. These are very, very hard conversations, and it's one of the fundamental reimaginations of the sexual revolution. All right, here's a third idea. Here's the third idea, and then we'll get into what we can do. Sexual autonomy and human dignity are synonymous. This is a sweeping idea. widely impactful across the board. And the only way to understand it is to understand the history of the concept of human dignity. We take human dignity as being a ubiquitous way of seeing the world. We take human dignity as being a given, that people should be treated with dignity and respect. We might not always do it, right? And we might not always think that everyone should have it. But the very idea of human dignity, especially universal human dignity, did not always exist in pre-Christian nations. In fact, atheists as diverse as Friedrich Nietzsche to Luke Ferry, and then even others like Tom Holland more recently, have pointed to Christianity as the one who gave human dignity to the world. Why? Well, think about it this way. You know the founding document, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. Now, that was in our founding document. We didn't even live it out. But let's take about the idea itself. Is equality self-evident? Look around the room. Seriously, wherever you're at, look around the room. Is it self-evident that we're equal? No. The most self-evident thing is that we are different. Some are young, some are old, some are male, some are female, some are tall, some are short, right? There's all kinds of differences. And yet our founder said it's self-evident. Why? Well, it can't be based on anything we have on the outside because not everybody has the same stuff on the outside. It's got to be based on something on the inside. And which worldview gives you a stable, universal, solid source internally, metaphysically for human dignity? Just Christianity. But see, we're now a culture that's skeptical. We're a culture that has rejected kind of the fundamental tenets of the Christian faith, certainly the moral tenets, and even, are skeptical on questions of origin and questions of morality, right? We think it's an outdated and an antiquated system, maybe good for you, but certainly not in the realm of public truth. The ideas that Christianity posits as public truths, they're not believable because they're religious. We have this wall between faith and reason. We have this wall between, what's a personal, private matter of faith and issues of public truth. But we don't want to give up human dignity. I mean, that's been one of the most remarkable developments in the history of humankind. You don't have human dignity, you go back to the days, in which there are these kind of gross victims of injustice, right? So what do we want to do instead? We want to maintain human dignity, but we got to tether it to something else. One of the most remarkable accomplishments of the sexual revolution has been to untether human dignity from the image of God and retether it, or at least try to sexual autonomy. The ability to do whatever we want sexually, even more, the ability to be whatever we want sexually. Even more, the ability to recreate reality itself around our sexual whims, our sexual choices, and our sexual impulses. So sexuality becomes the defining characteristic of the world that we live in. And everything else has to be adjusted and changed, even if my internal whims disagree with my external realities. Even if my internal sense of gender disagrees with my external body parts, then the body parts should change to meet my internal desires, not vice versa. There's not another way that we do that same sort of thing in any form of mental health issues, in any form of cultural reality. Only sexuality gets treated this way. So these are the three big ideas. And you can start pointing them out to your students wherever you find them, wherever you see them, and you will see them everywhere, that sex, marriage, and babies are separable. Unfortunately, too often, you'll see that one within Christian circles, not just outside of Christian circles. Secondly, that men and women are interchangeable. Talk about the common humanity that men and women have, and yet the distinctions that they have as male and as female, and how male and female distinctiveness is built into the very fabric of creation across the board. And then third, that sexual autonomy is synonymous with human dignity. Talk about the history of human dignity. Who gave it to the world? Why it can actually hold it together. Just telling you right now, anytime we've tried to assign dignity on any basis other than the image of God, entire groups of people get left out. In fact, they don't just get left out, they get targeted. They get targeted for extinction. Now, I want to tell you two more things before we wrap up this session. Here's the first. The title of this session is The Sexual Revolution and Its Victims, because bad ideas have victims. And there's all kinds of victims of the sexual revolution. Certainly women have consistently been victims of the sexual revolution. And there's somewhat of a moment of reckoning through the Me Too movement because of that whole kind of history and trajectory of the sexual revolution. But I want to talk specifically about children. The perpetual myth that has been repeated in various forms throughout the decades of the sexual revolution in one form or another. The kids will be fine. The kids will be fine. We'll do what we want, and the kids will be fine. We'll treat marriage as an institution of adult happiness, and the kids will be fine. We'll turn parenting into something else as opposed to moms and dads. We'll call it 2 parents or 3 parents or whatever, or 1 parent, and the kids will be fine. We'll allow kids to disassociate their inner knowledge from their biological reality. And do the only case in which we do this, in all kinds of questions about disorder, we certainly would never do it for an eating disorder, is tell a kid that their internal sense is somehow more reliable than the external reality. But we say it again, the kids will be fine. The kids will be fine. The kids have never been fine, which is why we have to have this talk as part of this module in this curriculum series, because you have the kids in your care. And these are the kids that are walking out of the context that God wants them to be in into a world that will consistently over and over and over victimize them. We haven't even talked about predatory porn. That's another way that they get victimized, not to mention sexual abuse. The list goes on and on and on and on. The kids have to be helped because the kids are the victims. Which brings the second thing. How do we help them? I'll give you 3 words. Number 1, truth. You have to tell the truth about sexuality. We may think that it gets in the way of the gospel. We may think that it's offensive. And yes, it is offensive today. But when we talk about the truth of sexuality, we're talking about the truth of being made in God's image. The battle over sexuality is not a battle over morality. It's a battle over cosmology, and specifically anthropology. What sort of world do we live in? Who are we as human beings? This isn't something we can just fudge on here or there. The second thing is grace. Grace. We live in a culture, and I don't know what it is even like for anyone to emerge from their teenage years sexually unscathed. Whether we're talking about 1 in 4 or 1 in 7 girls versus boys who are sexually abused, whether we're talking about, the average first exposure to awful pornography being at the age of 9 or 10, whether we're talking about the indulging of our dysphorias, or we're talking about the loss of mom or dad, or we're talking about any kinds of things. Victims of the sexual revolution need to know the grace of Christ. For some reason, when it comes to sexuality, we expect kids to be perfect. We should expect kids to be holy. But we need to understand that a sexual failure is not somehow the end of their walk with Jesus. When Jesus Christ went to the cross for our kids, He died for those sins too. And think about it. Aren't we glad that our entire future isn't based on our sexual failures in the past? So we need truth. We need grace. And then ultimately, the thing that they need to hear from us over and over and over and over and over again is identity. The truth about who they are as human beings. Now, as Christians, what we're quick to say is that, our identity is in Christ. And I understand what we mean by that, but that's not what I mean. Before we have an identity in Christ as Christians, every single human being has an identity given by God in creation. Before we're made new in Christ, we're made in His image. And the battle over sexuality is the battle over that chapter, the creation chapter of the story. Who did God make us to be? Now, what we're tempted to do is jump right to sexual morality. I love what T.S. Eliot said in an article about education. He said, before you know what to do with something, you have to know what something is for. Before you know what to do with something, you have to know what something is for. Can I suggest to you that too much of our sex education, too much of the way we talk about marriage in the church, too much of the way we talk about sexuality is due do. Here's what you should do. Here's what you shouldn't do. It's okay to do this. It's not okay to do that. Don't do this. Don't do that. Before we can help them embrace the right do's and don'ts of Christian sexual morality, they need to know what they are for. So it is essential that Christian schools start teaching students not only what to do and what not to do when it comes to sexuality, but what God created human beings for and what He created male and female for in particular.